He expected confusion, panic, a nation on its knees after the shock of Pearl Harbor. But when Roosevelt looked at the first reports coming across his desk, he saw something entirely different. Something that made him lean forward in silence. The attack had hit the Pacific Fleet like a hammer. Battleships burned in the harbor. Pilots were lost. The country stunned. In those first hours, the White House was a storm of voices. Generals demanding resources, admirals reporting chaos, aides rushing updates every few minutes. Roosevelt listened to all of it. The noise, the fear, the raw uncertainty. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked one question. How fast can America fight back? Nobody had the answer. Factories were still quiet. Shipyards were still repairing the wounded. And across the country, millions were waiting to understand what the president would do now. The nation was angry, but directionless. Roosevelt knew the danger wasn't just in the attack. It was in the possibility that America might hesitate. So he made the decision that would change the course of the entire Pacific War. Mobilize everything. Every plant, every shipyard, every hour of the day. At that moment, he had no idea how massive the response would soon become. No one did. Roosevelt's orders hit the Navy like an electric current. Within hours, admirals were drafting new production schedules, ones that looked impossible on paper. The president wanted ships, planes, carriers, engines, and he wanted them yesterday. Reports began to flow back to the White House, each more unbelievable than the last. Shipyards were switching to 24-hour shifts. Factories were tearing out entire production lines to replace them with machinery for military output. Engineers were sketching new carrier designs on lunch breaks. Workers, men and women, veterans and students, flooded industrial centers, ready to turn anger into action. Admiral after admiral arrived with updates that sounded like something out of fiction. New destroyers ordered by the dozens. Carrier construction doubled. Engine production tripled. One admiral put his notes down and told Roosevelt directly, "Sir, at this rate, we won't just rebuild the fleet. We'll outbuild every navy in the Pacific." Roosevelt didn't smile, but those around him noticed the shift in his posture. The moment he realized the country wasn't just responding, it was accelerating. America's industrial giants were waking up, and their first steps were already shaking the ground. When Roosevelt finally visited the shipyards, he expected progress, but not this. The moment his car rolled to a stop, he was hit by a wall of sound. Steel being forged, rivets snapping into place, welders throwing sparks that lit the air like fireworks. Massive hulls rose above him, half-finished giants of steel. Workers moved with impossible speed. Thousands of them, shoulder to shoulder, shouting instructions, hauling equipment, turning chaos into coordination. Some held up signs painted by hand, "For Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt watched in silence. This wasn't patriotism as a speech or slogan. This was patriotism made physical: metal, sweat, fire, motion. An aide leaned toward him to explain the process, but Roosevelt lifted a hand, not looking away. He whispered, "This isn't mobilization. This is a tidal wave." Everywhere he looked, another ship was taking shape. Destroyers stacked in rows, carriers growing like skyscrapers on their sides, cranes swinging non-stop as if powered by the anger of an entire nation. And for the first time since December 7th, Roosevelt understood. America's response was no longer emotional. It was industrial, relentless, organized, unstoppable. What Roosevelt saw next defied every expectation the Navy had set before the war. America wasn't just rebuilding, it was multiplying. Columns of fresh tanks rolled out of factories that had never produced a single armored vehicle before. Trains arrived with endless flatbeds of engines, steel plates, aircraft parts. Entire shipyard districts glowed through the night, their lights stretching for miles. Cities that existed solely to feed the war effort. Destroyers that once took a year were now launched in weeks. Carriers, the giants of the Pacific, began to appear so fast that Japanese intelligence refused to believe the numbers. One officer famously wrote, "The Americans are building ships faster than we can sink them." Assembly lines were no longer lines. They were rivers, constantly moving, impossible to stop. Everywhere you looked, the scale was absurd. Cranes lifting aircraft frames like toys, teams welding non-stop, convoys of trucks carrying mountains of supplies. Roosevelt received a new set of figures from the Navy. He read them twice. Production wasn't doubling, it was skyrocketing. Ratios the military planners had dismissed as fantasy were now everyday reality. For the president, this was no longer about recovery. This was about momentum. The kind of momentum that could tilt the balance of an entire ocean. When the latest production report arrived on Roosevelt's desk, the room went quiet. The numbers were unreal, the kind of projections his own advisors had once laughed off as mathematically impossible. New carriers scheduled months ahead of expectation. Aircraft output soaring beyond anything Japan or Germany could match. Marine divisions expanding faster than recruitment offices could process names. Roosevelt read every line slowly. Then he leaned back, the weight on his shoulders shifting, not disappearing, but transforming. The fear of December had dissolved into certainty. America was no longer reacting to the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was preparing to erase it. One aide recalled that the president looked almost stunned, as if witnessing something larger than the government, larger than the military, a national force that no order could fully control, only guide. He tapped the report with his finger and said quietly, "They woke something they cannot stop." It wasn't triumph, it was realization. The United States had begun a climb so steep, so fast, that the rest of the world would soon feel the shockwaves across the Pacific. Just months after the chaos of Pearl Harbor, the transformation was complete. America no longer stood on the defensive. It was surging across the Pacific with a momentum no navy in history had ever matched. New carriers moved out like floating cities, each packed with aircraft built on assembly lines that never slept. Fresh divisions of Marines, trained and equipped at a pace once thought impossible, boarded transports bound for islands few Americans had ever heard of. Supply ships followed in endless chains. Fuel, food, ammunition, spare engines, entire replacement squadrons. The Pacific, once dominated by Japan, began to tilt. Battles turned from desperate holding actions to coordinated offensives. At Midway, at Guadalcanal, and across scattered atolls, the industrial wave Roosevelt had witnessed in the shipyards started to crash forward. Every victory carried the same unmistakable imprint. The factories, the shipyards, the workers, the machinery. The United States had converted anger into output and output into power. Overwhelming, mechanical, relentless. Roosevelt understood the scale of what had begun. This was no longer just a response to an attack. It was the forging of a force that would push across the ocean, island by island, until the war itself had nowhere left to go. America had awakened, and the Pacific would never be the same. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the roar of a fleet reborn, America's transformation was unlike anything the world had seen. What began as shock and disbelief had become a tide of steel that reshaped the entire Pacific. Roosevelt had watched the country take its first unsteady steps after the attack, unsure, wounded, furious, and he had watched it rise with a force no enemy had predicted. New ships cut through the ocean where burned wrecks had once rested. Aircraft filled the skies where silence had hung after December 7th. Marines marched across islands that had seemed unreachable only months before. In every victory echoed the same truth Roosevelt had realized on those shipyard visits. America hadn't just rebuilt a fleet. It had rebuilt its identity. Powerful, determined, unbreakable. The war was far from over, but the outcome was becoming clear. The nation that had been struck at Pearl Harbor was not the same nation now crossing the Pacific. This new America was faster, louder, larger than the world had ever imagined. And as the president looked over yet another report of new ships launched, new divisions deployed, new victories won, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. History didn't turn because of the attack. It turned because of the response. The story of America's mobilization after Pearl Harbor isn't just about ships, factories, or numbers. It's about the moment a nation decided what it was going to become. Roosevelt saw fear turn into focus. He saw anger transform into industry. He witnessed a country that refused to stay on its knees. A country that built, forged, welded, and fought its way back into the war with such force that the world had no choice but to step aside. From the nightmarish smoke of December 7th to the endless lines of carriers stretching across the Pacific, one truth defined it all. America's power wasn't in its fleet. It was in its ability to rise faster than it fell. And there are countless moments like this, hidden turning points where history pivots, where a single decision or a single visit to a shipyard shifts the course of the world. If you want more stories that reveal those moments, stories that show how history really turned, subscribe. There's so much more ahead, and each one is worth hearing.